Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Hi, I'm Eliana Johnson, flying solo this week without co-host Chris Steyerwalt. Welcome to Ink-Stained Wretches, where typically we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. However, this week I am excited to welcome Jewish insiders Lahav Harkov to the podcast. Lahav is the senior political correspondent of Jewish Insider, and she is an Israeli-American, I think the dominant Israeli-American, American-Israeli journalist covering Israel and Israeli-American relations. And I'm going to let Lahav talk a little bit about her background, but the two of us have been talking about doing this for like 6 or 8 months to talk about American news coverage of the Israel-Gaza war. And we're going to talk about a bunch of articles, so depart from our traditional format. But Lahav, thank you so much for taking the time. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me on. I love the podcast.
Thank you. Wonderful to have you. Lahav, so I want to start just asking you a little bit about yourself. You were raised in the U.S., and you live in Israel now. How did you end up over there? And how did you get into journalism? And then wanted to ask you, you obviously grew up in the States, but live in Israel. How do those like dual identities, if you consider them, that sort of inform the reporting that you do now?
So the answer to your first two questions is basically my grandmother. But I grew up in the U.S. in a half Israeli family. My mother's Israeli. My grandparents, who also live in the U.S., are Israeli. We spoke Hebrew in the home. I spent some summers in Israel and a lot of other holidays in Israel with family. And so I always felt very strongly like that I'm Israeli and American. And as a teenager, I started to really want to live in Israel. And I moved here right after high school. My journalism story also comes from my family, really, because my grandmother also worked as a journalist for many years. She started out in her military career writing for the IDF's magazine, and it was during the Sinai campaign in the 1950s, and she has some interesting stories there. And she became like a features writer for many years, first in Israel and then writing for Israeli newspapers from New York. And she was always just like the most interesting person I knew. She always had the best stories. And to me, like being a journalist just sounded like it would be like a really fun and interesting life. And I was also always someone who loved to read a lot. So from a very young age, like middle school already, I started like writing op-eds for local papers and local Jewish papers. And really, like by the time I was 10, 11 years old, like this is what I wanted to do. And I was working for it.
So can you talk a little bit about how, I think we have a reporter in Israel, and I think that there's a category of news that is of interest to Israelis and a category of news that's interesting to Americans. And then there's the Venn diagram where these things overlap, and that's sort of where I see you operating. And I wonder if you can talk about, like, is that the audience you're intending to serve, which are like people interested in news of interest to both Israelis and Americans to the extent that they overlap, or like, what is it that you're trying to do?
So for most of my journalism career, the actual paid career, as opposed to, the middle school
let me
writing
back up.
op-eds. Yeah.
Tell us about your background, because you were at the Jerusalem Post before you joined Jewish Insider, which is how I came to know you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your path in journalism, and then we can get to this question.
Sure. So I moved to Israel, which in the Jewish community we call making aliyah, means sort of like ascending. So I ascended to Israel right after high school. And after a couple of years of national service, I studied communications and political science at a college here in Israel at Bar-Ilan University. And in my last year of college, I literally just answered an ad like online that the Jerusalem Post was looking for people for their sort of entry level position, and worked my way up. I worked there for 12 years. And my first prominent, I guess I would say, role at JPOS was to be their reporter at the Knesset, which is their legislature. And I did that for more than 8 years. So I was really covering Israel's domestic politics a lot and on a very deep and intense level. And this is also when I started tweeting a lot. And I was basically the only person tweeting in English about Israeli politics at this that I was reporting live on Twitter about Israeli politics. And around the time of the 2012 Gaza campaign, which was like a short, these mini wars that Israel had with Hamas, my account really started to blow up. So reporting on Twitter has always been like a big part of how people sort of came to find my work.
And then doing it in English, right? So it was accessible to Americans.
Yes. I was doing it before there were many people tweeting in Hebrew at all. Right. And I was doing it in English. And then Twitter is now big in Israel too, but I'm still tweeting in English most of the time.
Now, what first gave you the sense that this was the place to be, this was going to be a big thing?
I don't know, I was there already for fun, you know what I mean? And I at the time was reading a lot of celebrity gossip and all kinds of other things. And I realized that there was a lot of news happening there. So I thought, as someone who's in news and also wants to I didn't know I'd be at the same place for 12 years. So I wanted to put my name out there for other jobs and things like that. I started to, tweet. And at the Jerusalem Post, I was the only person doing that at the time. And then eventually they started encouraging more reporters to do that. I think now they more discourage people because Twitter, I can't speak to Jerusalem Post policy, but people get in trouble there. But at first, it didn't seem like a place where you would get in trouble.
Yes, that's certainly how I came to know you and follow your work. So walk us from covering the Knesset at the Jerusalem Post to, doing some of the first interviews with Bibi, when he's elected, and then deciding to move from a chiefly Israeli publication to an American publication.
So after about 9 years at the Jerusalem Post, it's considered a promotion at the Jerusalem Post to become diplomatic reporter. Specifically in the Jerusalem Post, the most read areas are military and diplomacy, which is typical for Israeli publications. So as diplomatic reporter, which basically makes you one of the leading reporters at the paper, you're the one who gets to interview the prime minister. So that's really how that happened. And I've interviewed Netanyahu several times, and I also interviewed Prime Minister Naftali Bennett when he was briefly Prime Minister of Israel. What was the second part of the question? Remind me.
Yes, your decision to jump from an Israeli publication to an American publication.
Oh, moving to Jewish Insider. It wasn't necessarily my thinking when I made the decision. There were just a lot of changes happening at the Jerusalem Post, and it was a good time for me to leave. And then it turned out that it was a really good time for me to leave because it was a month before the war broke out, and I was glad to be sort of in a different place at that time. But it is very different. It's more different than I expected it to be, because the Jerusalem Post is an Israeli publication, but the majority of its readers by far are in the United States. So I really thought that in some ways it would be very similar. But the thinking at Jewish Insider is a lot more thinking about an American target audience. Even though at the Jerusalem Post, I thought that I was thinking about an American target audience, but the Jerusalem Post views itself more as an Israeli newspaper of record. So I had to cover everything that was happening every day, whereas Jewish Insider is more selective about what it covers in each day. And I have to actually defend, why does this story matter? Why do I think that Jewish Insider readers, who are people who are very plugged in politically and are interested in politics that are related to Jews and Israel, but they're Americans, why would they want to know this, and why would it be important to them?
this is something that we'll get into more as we go through the stories, but can you describe what you've found are some of the key interests between Israeli news consumers, politically engaged Israelis, in terms of their news interests, and then the same faction of Americans that you're writing for? Like, what is the difference in the sort of news you're producing for those people?
I would say that before I moved to Jewish Insider, especially when I was focusing on the Knesset, on the legislature, I was covering a lot more things. I was covering what was happening in the Knesset every single day and the different steps of the way of different laws that were being passed, and a lot of domestic issues. I don't know whether it was crime or cultural issues. I mean, like anything can come up, right? Just like in my house, like anything could come up practically. And the truth is that American audiences, even those who are very interested in Israel, they probably don't care as much.
Right.
And, I can think of all sorts of things that happened when I was covering the Knesset, that like all the Israeli reporters would be running to one committee room and I would be like, I don't need to cover that at JPost. And with Jewish Insider, it's even more because they want to know what the one or two big stories of each day are. So they don't, it's not like they have a staff of, 20 reporters in Israel covering the big story of the day in every area of the news. They want to know the big thing happening each day.
Well, let's jump into some of the coverage of the war. And one of the things, maybe to set the scene on all this, that I had asked you is, I think we kind of kicked around, we're sort of chatting and saying, is the American press anti-Israel? We sort of thought, yes, they are, at least, I do. And then I said to you, like, does it really matter? Like, is there a material or, like, how important is this? And you had said to me, unfortunately, it really does matter. So before we get into the specific articles, I think it might be useful for you to give a perspective from on the ground in Israel about why American news coverage of this conflict, the way it's covered, the mistakes made, really does have an impact.
So, first of all, the U.S.-Israel alliance is a strategic asset for Israel on the defense level, where we get not just the military aid, but cooperation. Although I should clarify, because I see people make this mistake online, at least all the time, there's no American boots on the ground defending Israel. But, in terms of whether it's developing weapons together, Israeli officers will go to the U.S. for training. And of course, there's the military aid and money. And then on the diplomatic sort of international level, like the U.S. provides cover for Israel at the UN Security Council. And also in general, there are countries that, let's say, might be even more hostile to Israel than they already are, but they don't want to be sanctioned or condemned in some way by the U.S. So the fact that the U.S. and Israel are very, very close, and that's true, whether Democrats or Republicans are in office, to varying degrees, but there's still countries that are perceived as very close, is a huge asset for Israel. Now, the U.S. is a democracy, and I think the fact is, in any democracy, the leaders care about public opinion, and the media has a very big influence on public opinion. And so, Prime Minister Netanyahu is someone who was a real pioneer in this sense, that he was already in the 1980s talking about these kinds of things when I think a lot of Israelis didn't think about it and didn't care about it. And he was the deputy ambassador to the U.S. in the 1980s, and he would go on Nightline with Ted Koppel and give interviews about Israel. And it was something that, like, people in Israel didn't quite understand, and they were like, well, look at him, he's like pretending to be an American. But nowadays, I think that Israelis really do get it. They understand the importance, not only in the American media and media around the world. I mean, Al Jazeera and the way it portrays Israel, which and it's really just anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and all of these things, are seen as a real problem for Israel.
We'll come back to that at the end, because it's clear to me, sort of media insider who follows the stuff pretty closely, that Israel's at least tried to change the way it does its communications, engages with the press. And I'm curious in your thoughts the end we can get into the specifics. It's a little bit in the weeds, but how effective you think it's been. But let's start off with, there's no outlet to tie it to because basically every American outlet got this wrong. But right out of the gates in October, as this war started on Israel's part, when Israel struck back at Hamas, the American news media reported that Israel had bombed a hospital in Gaza and killed 500 people. And I would say within maybe half an hour, we started to hear from Israelis that this isn't the case. And over the ensuing hours, learned that this wasn't an Israeli bomb. It was a misfired rocket from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another terrorist group that operates in Gaza, that it didn't hit a hospital. It hit the parking lot, that 500 people weren't killed. It was far less than that. So these have all been, all of the original articles that ran in the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on and so forth have been taken down and amended. But I'm curious in your reaction to that incident and what it symbolized.
That was very early in the war, and I think that it just showed the credulity with which American media in almost across the board treated Hamas, right? They didn't say, oh, this is like a radical jihadist terrorist group. Maybe they're lying. They were just like, oh, they said Israel bombed this hospital and 500 people are dead. It must be true. And I mean, everything about the story was wrong, right? You were just listing there everything that was wrong with it. And unfortunately, they continued to treat Hamas as if they were like a trustworthy source. Now, I know that there's difficulty getting stories from Gaza because Israel was not letting journalists in for most of the war. And when they did let journalists in, it was for very limited amounts of time. So they were relying on stringers, and the stringers live under the dictatorship of Hamas and are limited in what they can say, right? But there should be some level of doubt. I've started to see more and more in news stories that when they talk about a death count, they'll write the numbers come from the Gaza Health Ministry, which doesn't differentiate between civilians and combatants or things like that, which is an improvement. But I just think that the Hamas narrative has been told too often without skepticism.
The Washington Post lead on that story was a strike on a hospital in Gaza City on Tuesday left hundreds dead, Palestinian authorities said. So it's not Hamas authorities, but it was Palestinian authorities said, sparking outrage across the region and elevating fears of a wider conflict as President Biden left for Israel on a trip intended as a show of support after Hamas's deadly assault on the country this month. So that was how it started. And as you mentioned, none of it was true. But I think you're right that there's been and continues to be a reference to or treatment of government agencies in a region controlled by terrorists as if they're a real or reliable thing with no, I guess a caveat is, these things don't distinguish between civilians and terrorists, but no caveat about the reliability of the numbers, which we've seen revised many, many, many times.
Right. And there's been all these, first of all, the Gaza Health Ministry itself has revised the numbers down.
Right.
But then you'll see people who will closely analyze the names and the numbers. Now you'll find large numbers of terrorists, right? People who after they died or were honored by Hamas as martyrs, or who on their Facebook had pictures of themselves wearing, terror uniforms of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. And they're just counted as if they're part of the civilian count. Or they'll talk about minors. And you'll have, sure, they're teenagers who are 16, 17 years old, but they're fighting. Hamas brings people of those age in to fight. So they're combatants. So there's all these ways these tricks that Hamas does with the numbers.
Another story that I wanted to talk with you about was one that got a lot of attention in some corners at the time. And that was a story a couple months after the hospital story that ran in the Washington Post under the headline, Israel's war with Hamas separates Palestinian babies from their mothers. I guess that headline is technically true, but it now contains a 3-paragraph editor's note at the top. And one of the paragraphs indicates the Post neglected to seek comment from Israeli officials for this article, an omission that fell short of the Post's standards for fairness. The article has been updated with a statement from an Israeli agency that implements policies in Gaza and the West Bank, and that says the October 7th attack by Hamas militants that killed 1,200 Israelis is the primary reason that mothers and babies remain separated. The article has also been updated to describe the post-October 7th status of travel permits out of Gaza. So the upshot of this piece was that mothers from Gaza travel into Israel or parts of the West Bank for specialized medical treatment for premature infants that is not available in Gaza, and that they were forcibly separated from these premature babies and were unable to find out the status of their infants or preemies. And the article itself did not, it said for security reasons, name, with one exception, any of the mothers or the hospitals or the medical personnel that it quoted. And it starts, when Israel sealed its border with the Gaza Strip after Hamas's deadly assault on October 7th, Muayyad and Mahmoud were among several dozen premature babies receiving care at neonatal wards in Israel and the occupied West Bank. Now, a war that has claimed the lives of more than 11,000 Gazans and erased entire families has also parted newborns from their mothers and fathers. And if you read through this, it essentially says Israel's not allowing that it forcibly booted mothers from these hospitals and is not allowing them back in. And when Post officials sought comment from the Israelis, you learn that actually it's the Palestinian Authority, not the Israelis, that facilitates permits into and out of these hospitals. And that once these mothers are in Israel, they can actually renew their permits to be there online. They don't have to go back to renew them. And the Israelis make pretty clear that any mothers that left their infants did so of their own volition, primarily to care for other children that were back. And then they do acknowledge the difficulty of getting back in once they were out, but they made clear that nobody was kicked out or separated. And
this reminds me of, I don't have the link for it, but it reminds me of a story that I heard from an Israeli diplomat earlier this year, that there was a child in Gaza who needed some sort of medical treatment that they couldn't get in Gaza. And Jordan wanted to take the child, to provide the child with the medical treatment, right? But they couldn't get the permit for the mother. There was some sort of difficulty. It was taking too long, whatever. So apparently the Jordanian ambassador to the U.S. contacted the Israeli embassy in Washington and asked them for help. And in less than a day, the Israeli embassy got it done and the mother got the permit to go to Jordan. A few days later, there was a story apparently in CNN. Again, I don't have the link now, but maybe we'll get it later for the show notes, about how the amazing job that Jordan did getting this Palestinian baby and her mother out of Gaza when the terrible Israeli authorities didn't want to let them out. When the real story was that, there was red tape, and the minute it was flagged, these people got out.
Yeah, this particular story was amazing to me in terms of how much was wrong in it, and then that the mistakes were all in one direction. And in addition to our show notes, we send out a newsletter every week, and so all of these stories will be in there. And this relates to something that the Israeli journalist Mati Friedman has written about, and I'm curious in your view on where he has noted, that in his view, he covered the AP, he was at the AP out of Jerusalem for several years, that many of the human rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, he noted that he doesn't believe that journalists have a very journalistic relationship with these sorts of groups, and that rather they are thoughtlessly purveying the claims they make, which I think leads to stories like these ones about the hospital in many cases. And I'm curious in your observation about that, and then about this story and others where the mistakes roll in one direction.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at these organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and there are others, they have a very, very anti-Israel bias in terms of like they're always critical of Israel and extremely focused on Israel at the expense of other things, right? Like the proportion between their reports and their statements on Israel to everywhere else in the world is just not within the proportion of whatever Israel might be doing wrong, right? Like you could agree with them that Israel's doing things wrong, but is Israel doing more things wrong than Iran, than China, than all kinds of other violators in the world? Israel is like way low on the list if you're trying to actually be realistic here, and also in proportion to, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, which are much less free societies than Israel, right? And over the years, there's been articles written by people who have left those organizations and have talked about the bias, including after October 7th, just that, that these organizations were maybe not sufficiently, I don't want to say like specifically because I don't remember who put out what statement, but that they were hesitant or hedging in their condemnation of the October 7th attack, which should be easy for everyone to condemn the indiscriminate slaughter of 1,200 people, including children, including people at a rave, who were partying and not fighting. And yet these supposed human rights organizations have a lot of trouble doing that. And I do think in terms of the media, they're taken as experts, right? And their word is often taken unquestioningly. These are the experts, they know. But the fact is, if the experts again and again fail to provide, fail to tell the truth, basically, then they shouldn't be considered experts anymore.
You had flagged, and I actually couldn't, I think because there's a little bit of code in here that doesn't translate in the US, I actually couldn't get to the original version of this story. So I'm going to need you to explain it a little bit. You had flagged a Reuters story, and you'll have to tell us the date. The headline is Gaza mother's hopes for return of long jailed son dashed. Can you walk us through this and talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, so the story's from February 25th of this year. And it's about a mother in Gaza who was excited for her son to be released from Israeli prison as part of a swap for the Israeli hostages, civilian hostages, each of whom was being exchanged for dozens of Palestinian prisoners, many of whom are terrorists who murdered people. So this woman's son was 17 years old, went to prison at age 17, and the article says, for killing an officer of the Israeli spy agency Mossad. On his family website, a newspaper report shows a picture of an Israeli soldier holding up the pickaxe used by this woman's son to kill the Mossad agent. An image of Dia, that's the terrorist who the website says was sentenced to 99 years, is superimposed. He was nicknamed.
So the family is still celebrating his crime.
Correct. And they say that his crime was killing a Mossad agent, except that he didn't kill a Mossad agent. He killed a random Israeli farmer. And this reporter just took his mother's word for it that he killed a Mossad agent. He didn't Google it. Like in Israel, like the stories of victims of terror are very widely available. And I know for a fact that there are people at Reuters who are fluent in Hebrew and could have found that, but they didn't bother. They took this family at their word. I mean, I don't think it's legitimate to kill a Mossad agent with a pickaxe either, right? But when you frame the story that way, it sounds like, oh, this was like part of the conflict between like two armies, even though, again, we're talking about a teenager and a random farmer.
So I actually was able to read, because what's on the Reuters site now is, if you click through to the original link, it says Reuters story on a mother's wait for her son's return from jail is withdrawn. Gaza, February 25th, a Reuters story about a Palestinian mother's wait for the release of her long jailed son, who was convicted of killing an Israeli, is withdrawn. Reuters has been unable to verify a link between the victim and Israel's Mossad spy agency, as stated by the Palestinian prisoner's family. There will be no substitute version. So it's unfortunate that that verification process didn't take place before the article was posted, but there you have it.
They took it down more than 10 days later also, which is a really long time for, the story got around. I'm sure it was republished in a lot of places.
Right. Reuters is a wire service, so many outlets, including the Washington Free Beacon, subscribe to the Reuters wire service so that we can republish their articles. I can guarantee you the Washington Free Beacon did not republish that article.
Yeah, at the Jerusalem Post, there was always a rule, which is that if there's a Reuters story about Israel, you have to go through it with a fine-tooth comb before republishing.
That's funny, because it just reminds me of one of my first job in journalism was at the New York Sun, and they have a legendary style book that's also a very, Jewish inflected publication, and that they drop down on your desk the first day that you work there. And I've kept it all these years because it's so amusing. And it says, any positive reference to a communist must be cleared by a top editor.
That's great.
Yeah, there are lots of things like that. Lahav, you had also flagged a long piece in the Atlantic. The headline is "The War That Would Not End." The piece is by Franklin Foer. I mean, this thing could basically be a book. It's a TikTok of the Biden administration's negotiations with, not directly with Hamas, but their efforts through Qatar and through Egypt and through Israel to stop this war from spreading throughout the region. And it basically goes day by day. But at one point in the negotiations, in the winter of 2023, I want to say, they help arrange the first ceasefire in which many women and children were exchanged for a pause in the fighting. And Foer writes that to influence the course of the conflict, the negotiators needed the assent of one man, Hamas's top leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar. His brutality toward Israelis and his indifference to the death of Palestinian civilians, his sense of theological certainty about his mission, and his resignation to the possibility of his own death made him an almost impossible negotiating partner. Even so, Foer writes, Sinwar thought strategically. He'd spent many years in an Israeli prison where he'd learned Hebrew and voraciously consumed news from international sources, and the hostage negotiators benefited from a fleeting confluence of interests. Sinwar wanted to release the babies and small children among the hostages. Having militants change diapers was not the end goal of his operation. And you had flagged this. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Just that line, having militants change diapers was not the end goal of his operation, is something that's haunted me since this article was published. Because if you don't want to change diapers in your dungeons in the tunnels under Gaza, why did you kidnap babies in the first place? Right? It's there's a very obvious question here. And this is something that I find in the coverage of the hostage negotiations in general, that they treat it as if this is normal, right? But no, they took 250 hostages, most of whom are civilians, about a dozen of whom were children, and they're just oh, they should be traded for murderers who are in prison, So in this case specifically, the diapers thing, right? I mean, ultimately, the youngest baby, Phil Bibas, one of those two redheaded, the baby, and then his brother, the toddler, right? They were ultimately murdered. So, had they decided they don't want to change diapers, they don't kidnap the babies, these babies' lives would have been saved. And so, just casually saying he doesn't want to change diapers as if that's just like a normal thing, I just found that I was like disgusted by it.
Lahav, on the subject of those hostages in particular, that the little kids, or the toddler and the baby, Ariel and Kfir, became world famous, they were obviously extraordinarily valuable hostages because Israel was willing to do so much to try and get them back. And I'm curious, one of your observations was that the news coverage of the hostage talks often puts a lot of the burden on the Israeli government to take actions to stop the war, return the hostages, and you note that they're still holding civilians, including many people who aren't Israeli at all. I'm curious whether you think, given the value of the hostages to Hamas and how much Israel is willing to do to get them back, whether you see any resolution to this conflict in which all of the hostages are returned. And I'm sort of surprised I haven't seen more coverage of that dynamic.
So in Israel, about 2 weeks before we're recording this, there was an interview on one of the more popular sort of news talk shows on TV with Netanyahu's spokesman, Omer Dostri, and he answered that question saying, probably not all the hostages are going to get out for that very reason. And everybody was outraged and furious. And like Netanyahu in like his following statement said, like, we're doing everything we can to get all the hostages out. Note that he didn't actually say that he is going to get all the hostages out. But I do think that in the sort of cold analysis of the situation, that they're not all going to get out. And it's very unfortunate. Now, there's something that the sort of hostage family forum and the activists for the release of hostages like to say, which is that there's a deal on the table that's all for all. If Israel stops the war and releases all Palestinian prisoners, then all the hostages will get out. But it's not, for starters, like, that deal was never taken beyond it was never a deal that was really negotiated. It was never a deal that was really on the table. It was like an opening bid that Hamas floated, right? Second of all, it would mean that Israel would have to continue living with a genocidal jihadi terrorist organization on its borders. Like, Israel can't end the war without getting rid of Hamas, and that could mean different things, but certainly doesn't mean what it is now, where they're still de facto in control of Gaza. So, and I think within Israeli society, there's some very sort of deep divisions and controversy about these issues, because when people say these things, the response is often, you don't want all the hostages to get out. And of course, Israelis want all the hostages to get out. This is a country that is haunted by October 7th. Everywhere you go in Israel, there's posters, there's bumper stickers, and we all really feel it, right? But you also have to think about the future. And so I think that there's a very, very high price that Israel is willing to pay and has paid to get the hostages back. But realistically, Hamas, the only way I think that we're going to actually get every last one of them out is to let Hamas survive. And I think that isn't something that Israel can do in the long term. It's sad to say, and probably I'll get yelled at by some people for that too. But
I was just about to ask you, how widespread do you think that recognition is in Israel?
I have seen a lot of polls that show something like between 2/3 to 3/4 of Israelis who say they support a deal to end the war and free all the hostages. So I guess I'm in the minority in this view, but it is also the view, I'm pretty sure, of the government if you look at what's been said. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about one last story. This one was on 60 Minutes that has had, I think, pretty major reverberations in the American media because of changes now to 60 Minutes in the run-up to an attempted Paramount merger with Skydance. and Paramount is the owner of CBS News. And this was Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes' interview with the freed hostage Keith Siegel. And let's just play this exchange between the two of them.
The terrorists became very mean and very cruel and violent.
More so.
Much more so. They were beating me and starving me.
Do you think they starved you, or they just didn't have food?
No, I think they starved me, and they would often eat in front of me and not offer me food.
As in they didn't have enough food.
Right. They just didn't have enough food. They were starving too. There just wasn't enough food in Gaza. And that did cause a lot of outrage. And now just this week, actually, the executive producer of 60 Minutes was forced out. And there's a new documentary, The Children of October 7th, which I have not watched. Have you seen this yet?
I haven't.
That the Paramount owner, Sherry Redstone, has put on Paramount Plus, so that's where it's available. And she had voiced her displeasure with this. But I think this does, to what you were sort of coming full circle here, to what you were getting at the beginning, Lahav, go to the credulousness with which the American news media takes the claims that come from Hamas, which is we're starving, there's not enough food. When in fact, they are stealing from the people all of the provisions that come into Gaza.
Right, that's exactly it. There were truckloads, hundreds of trucks entering every single day. It was like there were so many trucks lined up that they couldn't even get in fast enough. There were long lines of trucks going into the Sinai, but Hamas was taking control of large swaths of the aid. And we know that people calculated how many calories were entering Gaza, and it was enough to feed people for years, but Hamas was hoarding it all and then selling it at exorbitant prices. So, had she been paying attention to what's happening in Gaza and giving the terrorists less credit, she would have realized, no, they're not starving, and that she just asked a pretty dumb question, I have to say. Also, it's just the assumption that otherwise, if they had food, then they would be treating these hostages much better, wouldn't they? They tortured them. Keith Siegel, I believe he says it in this interview, he was forced to watch a Hamas terrorist sexually assault a woman.
Yes.
That was among the ways that, the woman was being tortured, but Keith Siegel himself felt it as psychological torture because he was watching this woman be tortured and couldn't save her. So why would you assume that they would, be serving him 3 meals a day?
Lahav, I'm curious in your take on this. Certainly this is my view. I've had other, pro-Israel or just, folks sympathetic to Israel share this view. But I think there is a view among like-minded folks that Israel is not that adept at dealing with the American news media and maybe the global media, though, we can really only speak for the American news media. One of the stories that we saw recently is Israel. The New York Times broke this story. They obtained footage off the dead bodies of some aid workers that showed that Israel mistakenly blew up the caravan of some aid workers. And it's interesting to me that it's often the American news media that breaks these stories about that fracture Israeli narratives about various things that happen. But I'm curious in your thoughts about how well Israel navigates the American news media, which, as we've discussed, presents lots of challenges to them. And then how do Israelis explain things like this?
So Israel messed up here. The IDF basically lied about what happened and sort of overstated I guess you could say what kind of targets they were, overstated how they said that I believe they said that there were 6 terrorists using the ambulance, and that was not the case ultimately. And part of what happened here, the media needs answers fast. And the army doesn't always have answers fast, right? And instead of saying, look, a lot of times the army, when they say we don't have an answer, that means that the Hamas story is what's going to get into the news, right? Which is also a problem. So somebody gave a fast answer that was a wrong answer, right? Which they were prioritizing speed over accuracy, which is a problem journalists have sometimes too. And it, ultimately, it ultimately was a problem was bad for Israel, right? Like, first of all, you shouldn't lie, but also like it didn't help anyone. But in the end, the army investigated and they fired the officer who called for, who approved that ambulance being shot, right? But it's sort of, the story became not just about these people dying, but about Israel lying about it, which is not where the army and where Israel should want to be. That being said, I think that there's an issue of proportion here, right? Where this, and then there was also the case of Jose Andres,
Right.
World Kitchen, right? That those people were also killed, and it was an accident that Israel admitted to. It becomes this huge, endless news cycle when there are a lot of other things happening, and again, we're talking about fighting with a terrorist organization that's essentially holding all the residents of Gaza hostage because it refuses to give up the Israeli hostages. So Israel messed up. It's a bad story about Israel, but it's a true bad story about Israel. But it's also a question of, like, is that the big story of the war, that Israel lied to journalists? I don't think so. It's a story, but it's maybe not a week-long news cycle.
One of the things that I've found frustrating, I guess, in all of this is that mistakes happen in war. Human tragedy unfolds in war. Of course, mothers, I assume, are separated from children. Civilians die in war. A lot of terrible things happen, and there's not like I don't find a ton of acknowledgement in the news coverage of all this that, yeah, like, war is pretty awful. All of this stuff is pretty awful. Like, that's why people shouldn't try not to start wars. But that there is no way to conduct an effective war, really, where you clinically take out only the enemy, particularly when it's an enemy that hides amongst, deliberately hides amongst the civilian population. Like, when you talk about this issue of proportion, to me, it's also, yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is just awful, but war is awful.
Yeah. I mean, and like, I would never say, like, don't investigate. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't say to the New York Times, like, if you have they have that footage, like, don't use it. Like, I think it's a story, but it's also, in the context that you provide to things and the background that you put into your articles and your, segments on TV. People talk about, like, this is it's a tragedy, but people talk about it like it's a unique tragedy, and it's just not. I mean, and I think if you look at the way the war in Ukraine is covered versus the way the war in Gaza is covered by the mainstream American media, I mean, it's just vastly different.
Well, let's close by talking about some of the best coverage you think has come out of this war. And I'm curious your thoughts and, who's done this really well, and then whether there's one or two sort of best pieces you might recommend to people based on your perch.
So first of all, there's something that Anderson and Cooper did that I think was really commendable, which is that within a few days of the October 7th attack, Anderson Cooper was interviewing the parents of a Hersh Goldberg-Polin, an American Israeli who was living in Jerusalem and was at the Nova party, at that rave that Hamas invaded and massacred people there. And they did not know what had happened to their son with certainty. They had heard from people who saw him that he had been in this sort of bomb shelter that Hamas had thrown grenades into, and then his hands had been blown off, and Hamas dragged him onto a truck. Cooper interviewed them, and while he was interviewing them, he realized that he had seen footage of this happening. that he thought he had seen their son in footage that he had seen. And instead of saying on live TV, oh, let me show you this video of your son, he waited till after the interview and talked to them and let them see it in private. And they've told this story, his parents have told this story after. And I think that that's like a really important human moment where, you know, as journalists, we all want to get the scoop and we all want to get the story, but also we have to remember that there are real human lives here. And I think that was a moment of sensitivity that is really commendable. And of course, the video has been all over since then, but that he took that moment and told parents privately, I thought was absolutely the right thing to do.
Are there any print pieces that have stuck with you?
I'm going to say, first of all, generally, the Wall Street Journal has done a very good job in its opinion section mostly, but they've published a lot of like analysis and articles. I mean, you guys have sort of talked about it, how like reporting have leaked into opinion and opinion have leaked into the news pages. So they've had some pieces that I think really reported pieces that have been really good. And I found them to be like, their reporters as well in Israel have been very good and have gotten a lot of good scoops and also been relatively keeping things in proportion. And, you know, I didn't prepare print. I didn't really prepare print links to share, unfortunately. So I'm like being very general here.
Yeah, no worries. No pressure. My print recommendation is this Mati Friedman piece that ran in The Atlantic, What the Media Gets Wrong About Israel. And the subheadline is, "The news tells us less about Israel than about the people writing the news." And I highly recommend it just as a background, you know, scene setter from somebody who, like you, Lahav, is living over there and who's worked for a wire service, and think it's super helpful. So I will leave folks with that, and so
it's
grateful.
Just worth noting. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
That Mati Friedman story is more than a decade old, but it reads like it happened right now. You know, it reads like he just wrote it.
100%. I should have mentioned it's from 2014, and at the same time he wrote an essay for Tablet magazine a couple months before that, I believe, about the editorial compromises that reporters make to get access inside Gaza. And that one is called An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. But I think that one is much better known than the piece in The Atlantic. So we'll link both of them in our newsletter. I just thought the one in The Atlantic, given what we are experiencing today, where nobody, you know, very few reporters that go inside Gaza because of the IDF's prohibitions on that this Atlantic piece was very, very helpful in sort of trying to understand the biases that we see. I think he explains them pretty helpfully. And yes, it is absolutely the same story. Lahav, thank you so much for taking the time. We are grateful and hope to have you back again soon.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. Maybe I'll have more positive things to talk about next time.
Oh, we hope. But I'm the negative one, so not required. But thank you so much.
Thanks.
That is all the time we have for the news about the news. If you have a story you want us to talk about, email us at wretches@nebulouspodcasts.com and sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcasts.com. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Wretches.